A note before this one begins. If you enjoy these old mountain tales and you like hearing them in a longer, quieter form, I have gathered a few of them into an audiobook collection for the late hours when the house has gone still and the stove has fallen to its softest red. You can find it in the usual place. And now, let me tell you about Ember Ridge. There are ridges in Appalachia that still do their burying without a shovel, and the people who live beneath them do not argue over what is under the earth anymore. They just keep their porches swept, their lamps trimmed, and their eyes off the window line. And before we go any further, tell me where you are listening from tonight. I read those notes. I remember more of them than I can explain, and it still unsettles me in the best way to think of a mountain story carrying itself into apartments, truck cabs, back porches, hospital break rooms, and little kitchens on the far side of midnight. This one came to me from Letcher County, but I held it a long while before speaking it aloud, because the last person who could tell it straight asked me to wait until she was gone. Her name was June Hale, 83 when she died, slight even then, black hair gone silver in 2 careful braids, gray eyes still sharp as creek water under cloud. She lived her last years in a white house above Isom with a blue bottle in every windowsill and a porch so clean you could have eaten a meal off the boards. Every November she walked, no matter what her knees said about it, up the old trace toward Ember Ridge with a folded handkerchief and a strip of blue ribbon in her pocket. She would not take company past the second switchback. She would not say much on the climb. But once, in the final autumn of her life, she sat across from me with her hands around a cup of chicory coffee and said, in the plainest tone a person can manage when the thing itself is trying to stay hidden, that the buried story of Ember Ridge had not been told correctly in 40 years, maybe longer, and if I meant to tell it at all, I was to tell it from the beginning before the mountain learned her father's name. So that is what I am doing now. I am giving it to you as she gave it to me, and as the few surviving papers gave it to her. I want you to picture eastern Kentucky in the spring of 1911, before the roads were properly roads, when the high seams still drew small companies and hopeful men into hollows too narrow for a wagon to turn without backing. Picture the chestnut not yet gone from the hills. Picture telegraph poles only where money had reason to climb. Picture a mountain people who knew the difference between what could be fixed with labor and what had to be endured with manners. Jonas Hale was 37 that April, tall and hollow-cheeked, lantern-jawed. With ash-brown hair, he cut himself with sheep shears and pale gray eyes that made strangers think him colder than he was. He was not cold. He was thinned by grief, which is a different thing altogether. His wife, Miriam, had died of winter pneumonia 13 months earlier, and the sort of quiet that follows such a death had settled into him so deeply that even when he spoke, it sounded like a man borrowing his own voice from another room. He had a daughter, June, 9 years old, slight and black-braided, with freckles over a narrow nose and the same gray eyes as her father, only wider, more openly searching. She carried a slate pencil in her pocket and a blue ribbon wound twice around her wrist because her mother had once tied it there to keep her from fretting at church, and after Miriam was gone the child kept the ribbon on as if some knots were stronger than death if only you did not untie them. The two of them came to Ember Ridge because Jonas had taken a timbering contract on a coal test site 3 hollows over, and because the rent on the Ridge house was cheap in the suspicious way cheap things sometimes are. The place belonged, or was said to belong, to a company clerk in Hazard who never once came to lay eyes on it. A friend of Jonas's named Beckett Rains, 44, broad-shouldered, sandy-mustached, with a sun-lined face and brown eyes that narrowed when he was thinking harder than he wished to admit, helped him hitch the wagon and climb the last stretch of washed stone to the house on April 14, 1911. Beckett was a practical man, the kind who trusted a chain measure, a plumb line, and a dry ledger more than any story told with lowered voice. He had worked survey camps when he was young, and he still kept a brass pocket compass in his coat for the comfort of knowing north without asking. The house itself was smaller than Jonas had imagined, though not mean. 2 rooms down, 1 low loft above, fieldstone chimney, plank roof silvered by weather, a narrow porch facing the slope, and behind it a stand of young hemlock that held the wind so well you could hear each separate stir of their needles. A spring ran 40 yards below the porch. A chicken scratch of a path led farther up toward an old cut in the ridge where, Beckett said, some company out of Lexington had once tried to find a seam and then lost its nerve or its money. There was a root cellar dug into the side hill, half collapsed, and a line of stacked stones running nowhere Jonas could understand. The place had the look of something left alone long enough to decide it preferred that arrangement. Buck took against it immediately. I should tell you about Buck because the dog matters. He was a black hound with a scar over the left shoulder and yellow eyes that usually carried the soft, foolish patience of an animal accustomed to children. He had belonged to Miriam's brother, and when fever carried that man off the previous year, the dog attached himself to Jonas and June as if grief in one house naturally recognized grief in another. Buck jumped from the wagon, trotted the yard, stopped at the porch steps, and would not cross them. He stood with his forelegs stiff and his nose working hard toward the clapboards, then backed away and put his belly near the dirt. Jonas coaxed. June called. Beckett laughed once, then stopped laughing when the dog began to whine without taking his eyes from the front wall. What do you make of that? Beckett asked. Jonas looked at the dog, then at the house. I make him foolish. He slept under louder roofs than this one. That was the right kind of answer for a first day, and perhaps the only kind a man can give if he intends to carry a child and 3 trunks into a place he has already paid for. They unloaded by late afternoon. Jonas swept, beat dust from the ticking, set Miriam's iron kettle on the hob, and chose the loft corner farthest from the chimney for June's pallet because she liked to wake to first light. Long sentences belonged to safe hours, and that first evening had the shape of safety. Wood smoke rose straight. A barred owl called once from low down the draw. June tied her ribbon to a bedpost while she unpacked a school primer. Jonas nailed a horseshoe above the door, not because he believed in it particularly, but because he had been raised by people who thought contempt for old habits was a pride the Lord enjoyed punishing. It was June who noticed the line first. On the morning of April 15th, the child stood on the porch with a biscuit in her hand and asked her father why the dirt was up against the wall. Jonas came out half-buttoned, hair flattened from sleep, and saw what she meant. Along the front of the house, where the clapboards met open air the evening before, there now ran a clean bank of packed earth nearly level with the porch boards. Not thrown earth, not slide earth, packed earth with old grass in it, little roots and 3 pale stones, as if that strip had rested there for seasons. Jonas crouched and pressed his thumb to it. Hard, cool. He looked downslope for signs of wash. None. He looked upslope for a slump scar. None. Even the dead leaves lay undisturbed. Beckett, who had slept in his own place below the creek, came up after breakfast with a sack of nails and found Jonas measuring from the door sill to the ground. 4 inches less than the evening before, Jonas swore. Beckett put his own stick to it and told him he had likely misremembered. Men do. Grief does not sharpen a carpenter's eye. Jonas took that without offense. But June, holding Buck by the collar because the dog would not come nearer than the gate, said very quietly, "It is different. The bottom board showed yesterday. Children see what adults step over. That is one of the mountain facts no courthouse ever recorded properly." Jonas shaved the new dirt away with a hoe. The bank came loose in neat dark clods and showed no fresh seam behind it, only more packed hillside. They worked it down to the old level, and by noon the matter looked silly enough that Beckett slapped Jonas's shoulder and called the ridge ambitious. No more. Yet when evening came, Buck again refused the porch. He would circle wide, nose to the ground, then stop below the east window and let out a short, strangled bark, 1 bark only, as if announcing a stranger he feared to name. That night June asked if she might sleep with the ladder to the loft pulled up, which was unlike her, and Jonas, who had no wish to make a timid child of her, told her no, then softened it by saying he would leave the lantern lit until the flame turned low on its own. The second morning, April 16th, the bank was back. Not 4 inches. 6. Jonas said nothing for a full minute. He simply stared. There is a kind of anger that begins when the world ignores the terms you thought you understood, and it does not yet look like shouting. It looks like stillness. Beckett came when sent for and stood beside him without removing his hat. Together they cut a straight measuring notch in the porch post and marked the earth line with blue carpenter's chalk. Then, because practical men prefer to turn strangeness into arithmetic, Beckett drove 2 iron pegs into the yard at 10 feet out and stretched a string level with the porch sill. The ground beyond lay normal, falling away in its natural pitch. Only the soil against the house had risen, packed hard as cellar clay. Maybe frost lifted it, Beckett said, though both of them knew there had been no frost. Maybe your string is lying, Jonas answered. String don't have enough wit for that. They laughed because the laugh was useful. They shaved the bank again. They cut a shallow trench along the wall. Beckett sprinkled flour at 3 spots after dark to prove no person came with a shovel in the night. June watched from the porch, her narrow fingers around the blue ribbon now untied from her wrist and looped through a slat. Buck would not come inside. He bedded beneath the wagon instead, muzzle on paws, waking at every creak in the hemlocks. On April 17th, the flour lay untouched. No boat marks. No drag. No paw except Buck's, and those never crossed the yard. The trench had filled, not with loose spoil but with the same old-rooted earth, level and firm. The line now nearly to Jonas's boot tops where he stood beside the sill. June looked at the wall, then at her father, and said the words that stayed with the story longer than most sermons stay with a town. Watch the window line. Jonas asked her what she meant. She only pointed. The east window, which had shown 3 full clapboards beneath its lower frame the day before yesterday, now showed 2. It was slight. It was measurable. It was impossible. Watch the window line. That was the phrase from then on. Jonas said it to himself that noon while planing boards at the test site. June whispered it over her primer. Even Beckett, who believed nearly everything could be corrected by standing back and measuring again, muttered it under his breath when he climbed to the house that evening and saw Buck crouched at the edge of the yard, hackles raised, staring at the glass. The dog would not bark now. He only watched. By the 4th day, April 18th, word had dropped through the hollow the way such things do, not by proclamation but by women at springs and men at mule lots, by a glance held half a second too long, by the fact that 2 boys who usually cut across the ridge to fish did not take that path anymore. A widow from lower on the creek named Lottie Finn, 51, broad-faced and red-handed from wash work, climbed up with a pan of beans and stood 3 careful steps from the porch. She had come, she said, because a man with a dead wife and a little girl ought not keep house alone while working daylight hours. She also came because the mountain had started talking and no one wanted to be the only fool pretending not to hear it. Lottie saw the soil line and crossed herself before remembering Jonas was not Catholic and might take offense. He did not. He was too tired to take offense. The earth now sat flush with the porch edge across half the front. Beneath the east window there remained 1.5 clapboards visible. Beckett fetched his chain and measured from the spring path to the porch, from the porch to the hemlock, from the chimney base to the yard pegs. Every distance held true except the wall-to-ground height, which was less again by nearly 3 inches. They dug at the bank with a mattock. The hillside behind the new line gave no sign of having moved. Grass at the top of the rise lay as old as any June pasture. It was as if the mountain had learned a house's shape and was trying to wear it. That evening June refused to draw at the east window. She had a habit, her father said, of sitting with her slate in the best patch of light and making little maps of places she had only heard named. On April 18th she took her slate to the table instead, back turned to the glass. Jonas asked why. The child said, because something under there keeps nearly knowing how high to look. Now listen. I am not one of those storytellers who stuffs a child with old wisdom because it sounds uncanny in a tidy way. Children say strange things because fear has fewer manners in them. June did not know what she meant any more than you would have. But the wrongness in the room had begun arranging itself around the windows, and a child can feel arrangement before a grown person will consent to the shape of it. On April 19th rain passed the ridge without falling. That matters because there was no weather to blame. Jonas came home from the timber cut with pine dust in his cuffs and found Buck gone from beneath the wagon. For one thin, terrible moment he believed the dog had finally bolted uphill and vanished. Then June called from inside that Buck was under the house. Not prowling. Under it. Belly to earth. Growling so low the floorboards seemed to catch the sound from below and keep it. Jonas lay flat on the porch and called him. The hound crawled out backward, ears plastered, refusing to show the dark undercroft of the house his face. When he cleared the light, Jonas saw clay packed between the lower stones of the piers where open air should have been. The crawl space itself looked shallower. That was the first day Jonas did not sleep in the house through to dawn. He sat up in a chair with the shotgun across his knees, though what he meant to shoot he could not have said. Around midnight he heard, not from the woods, not from the road, but from somewhere low and close along the front wall, a patient brushing sound. Not digging, not scratching, more like a palm passing over cloth. Brush, pause, brush again. He opened the door with the lamp raised high. The yard was empty. The stars were clear. The earth line, in the yellow spill from the lantern, looked smooth enough to have been finished by a mason. When he put the lamp low, the flame threw no shine from the bank at all. It drank light. The fifth morning, April 20th, the lower edge of the east window frame touched dirt. Short sentence. Because sometimes a story demands one. Jonas did not go to work. Beckett took one look at the wall and said they would set stakes. Not beside the house now. Through the yard and against the sill itself. He and Jonas drove a row of chestnut laths into the ground at measured intervals, each cut with knife marks corresponding to inches below the window frame. If the earth rose by evening, they would know it exactly. Lottie carried June to her place for the afternoon, saying a child need not witness grown men swearing at dirt. June went only after tying the blue ribbon around the porch rail and telling her father not to untie it till she came back. Buck followed the child, but twice he stopped and looked behind him toward the house, as if expecting it to shift while watched. When the men returned at sundown, the stakes nearest the wall had sunk to the second knife mark. Not tilted, not loosened, surrounded by the same packed, root-bound earth. Beckett knelt and put his cheek to the ground as if listening for water. What he heard, if he heard anything, he did not say then. He only stood and told Jonas they needed someone older than either of them, someone who knew the ridge before companies started renaming places after the men who owned paper in Frankfurt. That is how Effie Marr entered the story. Effie was 71, small and bent, with an iron-white braid down the back of a dark homespun dress, amber-brown eyes clouded at the edges, and arthritic hands that never stopped moving over one another when she thought. She had delivered half the hollow, buried a quarter of it, and sat up with the rest through fever seasons. If a spring changed taste, if a milk cow balked a certain pasture, if a widow dreamed 3 nights running of muddy shoes on a clean floor, people went to Effie not because they expected solutions but because a life lived that long in one place becomes a kind of map. Effie came on April 21st just after noon, carrying no Bible and no charms, only a hickory cane and a face already sorrowful before she reached the yard. She did not step on the porch. She did not touch the wall. She stood at the east window and measured its lower sash with her eye, then looked downslope toward the spring and upslope toward the old test cut. At last she said, "It found the right house after all." Jonas asked what she meant, sharper than courtesy allowed. Effie took no offense. Old people who have sat with enough dying know anger is often only terror trying to keep its boots on. She asked instead where the child slept, how long since the dog had crossed the threshold, whether there was warmth in the floor at night, whether anyone had noticed a smell like spent matches after rainless weather. To each question Jonas answered yes, no, yes, and yes. Effie shut her eyes. Then she told them what she knew and only what she knew. In 1887, when the chestnuts were still thick on Ember Ridge, a prospect company sank a short entry above the spring, chasing a seam that pinched thin and bled gas. There was a cook shack, a tally shed, and, for one feverish summer, an isolation house set apart from camp where 2 boarders and a mule boy were kept when bloody flux went through the men. The fever house stood where Jonas's rental stood now or near enough to make no comfort of the difference. One hot August night a foul pocket from the test entry came loose. There was no blast anyone could point to afterward, only a sudden breath of bad air and a fire that ran under the roots. Men threw clay at the cut mouth. They smothered what they could. They hauled the sick from the fever house too late, some said, and not all the names entered the ledger, because companies in those years were stingy with records when records might cost compensation. The old people said the ridge hated being covered before it was done burning. Effie said any roof put over that place afterward would be asked to lie lower. Beckett snorted once, not in mockery but from discomfort. Asked by what? Effie looked at him. by what happens when men bury the wrong thing too soon. That was not an explanation. It was a hand laid on the outside of explanation. You understand the difference. She would not tell them the mountain was haunted in the neat churchyard sense. She would not say spirits. She would not say curse. She spoke instead the way old people speak when certainty has taught them humility. She said only that some places, once made to keep a secret, develop a habit of keeping it, and that Ember Ridge had always been a place where the ground corrected the living if the living forgot where they stood. Jonas asked what to do. Effie answered too quickly. Don't wait for it to reach the upper panes. Then, softer, watch the window line. June returned from Lottie's while Effie was still there, and the old woman crouched with a wince to tie the child's blue ribbon back around her wrist. Buck, for the first and last time during those days, crept 3 steps onto the porch and pressed himself against June's leg, trembling hard enough that the boards answered him. Effie laid a hand on the dog's scarred shoulder and said, almost to herself, animals know what floor a thing belongs under. Before leaving, she told Jonas one more story, perhaps because she saw that he needed something shaped like a rule. After the 1887 fire, a family named Kester had tried to repair the abandoned fever house for autumn lodging. By the 3rd morning, the stoop sat level with the yard. By the 6th, one window was half gone. They left before full dark that same day and never returned for their bedding. When men came a week later, the house was sunk to the eaves with no slide around it and chicory still blooming upright at the corners. My father said the flowers looked embarrassed, Effie told them, like they had kept blooming in a place that ought to have remembered grief better. Now a careful plan took shape, which is to say the story gathered the thing it would soon interrupt. Beckett proposed jacking the house and skidding it downslope at first light with Jonas's mule and 2 more from the creek. If the ridge wanted that exact patch of earth, then the answer was simple: move the house off it. Jonas agreed because it was a carpenter's answer, and carpenters must begin with what the hands can attempt before yielding to what the heart suspects. They spent April 21st afternoon cutting rollers from young locust, fetching a second chain, and clearing brush from the lower path. Beckett marked the yard with chalk and figured angles aloud. Jonas moved boxes onto the porch and told June they would sleep one more night in the loft, then wake early and start fresh down by the creek in Lottie's spare room until he found another rental. June listened and nodded, but her gaze stayed on the east window. There was dirt halfway across the lower pane now, not smeared there, not splashed there, resting there. Outside the glass, the packed earth met the sash with impossible politeness. The child said, if it wanted the house, why did it wait till we came? No one answered. The mountain had another way of keeping silence. That evening, chickens from no one's yard in particular, 3 speckled hens and a rooster with 1 bent tail feather, walked up from below and settled beneath the wagon instead of returning to their own roosts. They faced the house, all of them. After dusk, 2 mules in Beckett's lower lot brayed and strained their halters until he moved them to the creek meadow. Near 10 o'clock the whip-poor wills stopped at once. Not dwindled. Stopped. The hush after that carried so much shape that Jonas could hear the floor settling under his own boots like a person drawing a breath before speech. About here, if you have ever sat in a room and known before any proof arrived that something was wrong in a way you could not politely explain, then you already understand the next part better than any summary could manage. Have you ever felt that? Not fear from imagination, but that bodily knowledge, low and exact, that the world has shifted one notch off its proper peg and expects you to act before you can justify it. If you have, then keep that feeling near for a moment. And then let's go back to the story. The subscribe break that sometimes appears in these tales was never part of June's telling, so I will keep us close to her version. The important thing is this: they meant to move the house at dawn. The ridge did not wait for dawn. At 11:30 on the night of April 21st, Jonas was below folding blankets into crates while June, still dressed, sat in the loft with Buck pressed against her knees. Beckett had gone down to fetch the second mule and returned before first light. A lamp burned on the table. Another stood upstairs on the floor near the pallet. Jonas later wrote, in the brief account he left, that he first knew the plan had been interrupted because ash drifted from the chimney into the room, though there was no fire lit. Not a fall of soot. A soft peppering. Then came a sound from under the east wall. Not a slide, not timbers, a slow, blunt thump, as though a heavy fist had struck earth from the other side. He took the lamp to the window. Dirt, more of it. The lower half of the pane had vanished behind packed clay while he watched. It did not slither upward. It simply arrived higher, the way shadow arrives when a cloud passes and you were looking elsewhere for one blink too long. Jonas dropped the lamp chimney in his haste and cut his fingers catching it. June began to cry out from above. Buck answered with one broken howl. Jonas snatched the shotgun and pulled the front door wide. It opened 6 inches, no more. Earth held it. He rammed his shoulder against the planks. Nothing. He ran to the back. Same. The rear step, which had stood knee-high from the slope that morning, now met a wall of black dirt flush with the threshold. He struck it with the gun butt and only bruised the stock. When he came back through the room, the lamp flame near the table had turned long and blue. Along the floor by the east wall, fine grains of dirt began to leak inward between the lowest boards as if the house were already below grade and the soil had found a seam. June shouted from the loft, "Pa, the window line! Watch the window line!" Jonas climbed so fast he nearly overturned the ladder. June was crouched under the rafters, face washed pale, Buck between her and the shutter. Through the loft's small gable window, which looked east over the rise, the night showed wrong. He could still see stars above the ridge. But below the gable frame, where open air ought to have dropped to the porch roof, there was dark earth close enough to touch. The mountain had climbed past the first story and reached the lower edge of the roof outside the loft. Short sentences again, because that is how panic cuts the world. Dirt at the loft, stars above it. No slide. No sound of slide. Just height where height should not be. Jonas did what loving fathers do when there is no time to be afraid properly. He moved. He shoved the shutter hard with both hands until the old latch tore free. Cold air came through, thin and mineral, carrying the smell of wet clay from a day with no rain. The porch roof lay only a drop below the window, and beyond it the yard had risen into a slope where flat space had been. Not natural slope. A smooth lift, steep and packed. June could not climb down it. She would have to go over the roof to the west side where the ground still fell away. Beckett came running then, mule bells clashing below. He had seen, from the lower switchback, the outline of the house changed against the stars. He reached the west wall and shouted that the front windows were gone. Jonas thrust June through the gable opening onto the roof, one boot at a time, Buck scrambling after her with claws skittering on shingles. Jonas told the child not to look east. He said it twice. He tied one end of a rope around the chimney and the other under June's arms. The roof slanted more sharply than it should have because earth now pressed halfway up the east pitch. From the yard below, Beckett and Lottie had followed him despite every instruction, spread their arms to guide the girl down the west edge. June later said the shingles were warm under her palms. Remember that. Jonas lowered her. Slow. Then faster when the chimney gave a small inward pop. Buck tried to go after her and slid, caught, scrambled again, and at last leaped blind into Beckett's shoulders below. The moment June touched ground she turned and saw, by starlight and Beckett's swinging lantern, the east side of the roof already buried to the ridgepole. Not covered from above by fall, but met from without by earth that had risen level and smooth as if laid there by giant patient hands. "Jump!" Beckett shouted. Jonas did not jump. Here is the part people always retell wrong. They say he went back for money, or for the dead wife's Bible, or because mountain men are stubborn beyond reason. June was clear, and that would have been enough for many stories. But June swore to her last day that her father looked past them toward the loft floor and said, very distinctly, her ribbon. The blue ribbon still hung tied to the porch rail below, forgotten when June came home. A small thing, a foolish thing to turn for, unless you have buried one love already and cannot bear to tell your surviving child that you left the symbol of her mother for the mountain to keep. Love makes beggars of our judgment. It does not make cowards of it. He slid back to the gable opening and vanished inside. Beckett lunged toward the wall, then stopped because the west eave dropped an inch before his eyes. Not fell, settled. Lottie grabbed his coat and screamed that the roof was going. June tore free and ran 2 steps uphill before Buck caught her dress hem in his teeth and yanked so hard the cloth ripped at the seam. The child went down on one knee, still reaching. Those below heard Jonas moving inside. One tread overhead. Then another lower. Then the blunt thump again from somewhere under the east rooms, only nearer now, as if whatever had been below the floor had reached the place beneath the stairs. The lantern in Beckett's hand showed the west gable window empty for a heartbeat, then filled. Not by a face, not by a figure, and that matters, but by the dark square press of earth where the opening had been. The whole house sighed once, deep and timbered, the sound a chest makes when a life leaves it. After that the roofline slumped inward at the center, and the remaining visible wall sank to waist height, then chest height, then almost nothing at all while the grass around it stood unshaken. June screamed her father's name until the name itself broke apart. No heroics now. No frantic digging montage with men redeemed by exertion. That is not this kind of tale, and it was not that kind of night. Beckett and Lottie clawed at the nearest soil because hands must do something. Their nails tore. Their palms bled. The dirt resisted like old cellar floor. 2 more men arrived from below. Cal Reeson, 33, thick-necked and black-haired, and Reverend Amos Pike, 66, long-faced, white-bearded, with a stoop from riding bad saddles over worse roads. And together they attacked the west edge with shovels. By 1 in the morning they had opened a pit deep enough to prove only this. The wall that should have been there was now farther in than the room allowed. The geometry had gone wrong. Beckett measured the remaining visible chimney base against the porch stones still barely showing and began cursing not like a frightened man, but like a surveyor watching numbers turn traitor. At dawn the house was buried to the ridge of the roof, and by full sun even that ridge was gone. In its place lay a long grassy hump, damp with morning dew, the blue ribbon half caught at the edge of the turf as if pressed there by a thumb. Not a landslide, no broken trees, no spoil fan. The porch posts were invisible. The east window had ceased to be a window and become, in the language of ordinary earth, nothing at all. They dug until noon and reached the chimney stones 3 feet below the new grade. The stones were warm. June said so first, then Beckett confirmed it. Warm not from sun because the slope still lay in shade. Warm from under. When they cleared around the lintel of the hearth, they found fresh clay packed tight in the firebox from the inside out. Not dropped in from above. Pressed outward through the opening, as if a hand beneath the hill had filled the chimney throat and tamped it level. No body was found that day. None the next. On April 23rd, county men arrived with shovels, lines, and the kind of public voice officials use when they mean to sound firmer than the facts allow. One of them was Harlan Vowell, 58, barrel-chested, iron-gray whiskers, deputy in 3 administrations and proud of having seen every variety of foolishness a mountain could produce. By mid-morning he no longer spoke in the public voice. He had watched Beckett take a transit site from the yard peg to the spring marker and then to the chimney stone. The benchmark at the spring held exactly. The peg held. But the chimney and the buried floor line stood lower than they had any right to stand by nearly 7 feet when compared to the unchanged slope beyond the wall. You can follow that with a chain. You can prove it on paper. The house had not merely been covered. It had been made deeper in place. That afternoon Effie returned carrying a basket with bread no one touched. She sat beside June under the wagon and did not ask the child to stop staring at the hump where her home had been. Old people worth anything know which requests are insults to the truth. Reverend Pike prayed. Harlan Vowell ordered a wider dig. Beckett kept measuring because a mind near breaking will sometimes save itself by repeating the action it still believes in. They reached the top of a buried doorframe by sunset. Behind it there was no room, only more packed earth, though the frame was undeniably a doorframe, hinges and all. Beckett sat back on his heels and said, very softly, as if speaking too loud might invite correction from the hill itself, that door belongs to air. Watch the window line. The phrase changed meaning then. It no longer meant track the danger while it climbs. It meant remember that a thing which takes the windows first means to erase the witness, to remove the part of a house that proves it was ever meant for light. June spent the next week at Lottie's. Buck would not leave her side. If she walked to the spring, the dog walked before her. If she slept, he slept with his head across her feet. Twice in the night Lottie heard the child rise, go to the doorway, and whisper into the dark, "I kept it, Pa. Kept it." Only later did Lottie understand she meant the ribbon. The strip of blue cloth found at the edge of the new grass became June's private relic. She washed the dirt from it in spring water and never again tied it to any railing. But the story did not end at the burial. It had to survive confirmation, and confirmation came from the world that usually prides itself on denying mountain testimony. Beckett would not let it rest. On April 28th, 1 week after the night of the sinking, he rode with Harlan Vowell to the county seat and then farther on, following deed notes and company references with the flat obsession of a man who has seen reality bend and wants the record to suffer the embarrassment with him. In the courthouse basement they found 3 old map rolls from the Ember Consolidated Prospect Concern, a company extinct before 1895. One roll had mildew on the edge and mouse chewing through the twine. Inside lay a site sketch of the 1887 test cut, the spring, the tally shed, the mule pen, and, marked in red pencil with a clerk's cramped hand, a rectangular structure labeled only I House. Its dimensions matched Jonas's rental within inches. That could still have been coincidence if the rest had not followed. Beneath the site sketch was a cross-section diagram, the kind mining men draw when they want to understand what is under their fear. It showed a shallow entry running into the ridge, a burned cavity sketched as a smudged pocket, and above it, at the surface line, the fever house. Then, in a later ink likely added after the fire, the same rectangle was drawn again lower in the section, several feet beneath the first, with one note beside it, covered in place. No further claim. Beckett carried that paper for 20 years in oilcloth. June saw it many times. I saw a copy made from it before damp ruined the original. The phrase matters. Covered in place. Not removed. Not collapsed. Covered in place. Yet every old mouth in the county agreed the fever house had been dragged off and burned. The company record, written by men with no use for superstition, said otherwise. It implied that some structure had been left below, at depth, roughly where Jonas's house later stood above it. And when those county men returned to Ember Ridge with the sketch and measured from spring to chimney to the old test cut, the lines matched too well for comfort. The house Jonas rented had been built almost exactly over the footprint of what had been covered. You may think that sounds like explanation. It is not. A buried old house beneath a newer one does not account for ground rising without disturbance, windows disappearing overnight, or a doorframe found where air should have been. It only proves this much. The ridge had a memory organized around that spot, and the bureaucrats who would happily have laughed at mountain fear instead provided the cleanest proof that the place was wrong in a manner records could touch but not resolve. There was one more confirmation, quieter and, to my mind, worse. Harlan Vowell, who had begun the week by treating the whole affair as a dramatic landslip, filed a statement on May 2nd noting that grass cut from the new mound at the buried house site showed root depth inconsistent with 7-day growth. In plain language, the sod atop the mound behaved as though it had been there much longer than it had. He did not write miracle. He did not write impossibility. Men paid by counties almost never do. But he signed his name under the observation, and that is often braver than rhetoric. June never lived on Ember Ridge again. That is the practical line histories like to draw, as if avoiding a place were the whole cost. The real cost took years to reveal itself. She grew. She learned to read ledgers better than some bank clerks. She married late and briefly, to a machinist named Owen Tripp, 31, dark-browed and soft-spoken, who died in a rail accident before their second winter. After that she kept house alone and gave piano lessons to children with inattentive hands. She laughed, by all accounts, more than one expects from the keeper of such a story. But every residence she took for the rest of her life shared 3 qualities. Windows high from the ground, a porch with open sight on all sides, and no room built against a raw hillside. If a cellar door swelled in damp weather, she would not sleep over it until it opened freely again. As for Beckett Rains, he lost some easy portion of himself on Ember Ridge and never found it. He married no one. He worked survey jobs where he could, though friends noticed he no longer took contracts involving old mine entries or abandoned company land. Once, years later, A younger man asked him why he always measured house lots twice from the lower corner. Beckett replied, because the high ground likes to cheat, and would explain no further. In his 50s, he developed a habit of pausing outside any building to study the nearest window, calculating, perhaps without meaning to, the mercy of visible clapboard beneath it. Watch the window line. He had taken the phrase into his bones. Effie Marr lived another 11 years. When she was near death, she asked June, who had come to sit with her, whether the dreams still came. June answered yes. Effie said, "Then don't dream standing up there." That was the last warning she offered, and it contained all the helpless tenderness of age. Not a recipe, not a cure, only a border drawn in language between what could be survived and what should not be invited. Now we come to the small ritual, the true end of the story. Not the burial, not the records, the ritual. Every November 22nd, the date after some confusion settled as the anniversary of Jonas's loss because it was the day June first returned alone as an adult, she climbed the old trace to Ember Ridge carrying two things: a folded white handkerchief and Miriam's blue ribbon. She would stop at the flat place where the hump had softened over years into what looked, to strangers, like an ordinary rise of ground beneath broom sage. Then she would smooth the grass with her left hand, lay the handkerchief down square, place the ribbon on top of it, and say, no louder than grace before supper, "I kept it above the sill." That was all. No speeches to the dead. No gualing. No drama for the benefit of anyone kind enough to pity her. She simply repeated the act year after year, until the path itself seemed worn by memory more than feet. If rain threatened, she still went. If her joints flared, she went slower. When she was too weak for the climb alone, she rode as far as the second switchback with a nephew's boy, then dismissed him. That handkerchief never stayed behind. She always took it home clean, even when the grass was wet. The ribbon grew thin. Once it tore and she stitched it with white thread so small you had to hold it to sun to see the repair. I asked her once why the handkerchief mattered. She said because dirt should never touch the ribbon again. Then, after a long while, she added, and because if he comes to a window somewhere, I want there to be something white enough to show him the height of light. You may decide for yourself what that means. I have had years to sit with it and still do not trust any summary. Some griefs build theology out of household objects. Some mountains teach the same lesson from the other side. The present-day continuity is easy enough to state and hard enough to hear. Ember Ridge still stands. The old test cut has caved almost shut, and the chestnuts are long gone, but people in that part of Letcher County will still tell you there is a patch on the upper slope where the grass greens a little early in spring and browns a little late in fall. Hunters do not camp there if they can help it. Dogs go around. Children are warned, without any proper explanation, not to roll marbles or apples across that rise because the ground keeps what moves downhill toward the old house seat. Even now, in very dry autumn, when the light slants low from the west, some say you can stand below the hump and trace a darker band through the broom sage at the exact height a lower window frame might once have been. A window line without a window. More than one schoolboy has tried to prove the talk foolish by standing there at sundown with a stick held level to the band in the grass. And more than one of them has gone home with that brave look boys wear when they are ashamed of being frightened by something they cannot strike or shame back. None of them stayed for full dark. And there is this as well, though I offer it the way one offers all mountain testimony. Carefully. More than one person claims that on certain cold nights, if you come up the switchback after moonrise and stop before the hump, you can hear what sounds like a palm moving slowly over cloth. Brush. Pause. Brush again. As if somebody inside a room below the earth is trying to smooth a wrinkle before company arrives. I do not know whether Jonas Hale died the instant the house went under. I do not know whether anything human remained conscious beneath that place after the roof disappeared. I do know that the mountain took him in a way the county could not deny, that a child spent 70+ years tending a tiny border between dirt and memory, and that the records meant to reassure us instead leaned their official weight upon the scale of the impossible. There are bureaucratic lies, and there are bureaucratic confirmations. This story has suffered from both. What we call courage in these tales is often something smaller and sadder than bravery. It is the willingness to keep loving a person after the world has hidden the place where love is supposed to go. June Hale did that. She kept a ribbon clean. She kept a date. She kept a path open with her own feet. And perhaps that is why she could finally tell it. Not because the mountain had released anything, but because she had learned how to speak around what would never come back without reducing it to a campfire trick. If you grew up in a place with an old warning nobody fully explained, if your people had a bend in the road they did not whistle through, a field they cut wide around after dark, a cellar door they always latched twice, then you know the moral already. Respect is not the same thing as fear. Sometimes it is wiser. Sometimes it is how the dead continue tutoring the living when no clean lesson can be written down. And I will ask you the same thing June asked me, though in gentler terms. If there is a piece of local folklore where you come from, the sort of story your family tells plain and the outsiders laugh at until one small fact makes them stop laughing, leave it for me. It might become the next story I tell. The mountains are not the only places that keep a buried account. Before I leave you, I will say this much. Somewhere over in another county there is said to be an orphan church with bell rope worn smooth by hands that belong to no listed sexton, and one day I may tell you how the floorboards there learn to ring before funerals. But for tonight, keep your light above the sill.